How far would you go to save your family? Imagine being so small that the world towers above you, and yet you carry the weight of your family's survival on your tiny shoulders. This is the story of a little girl who took a step that no one saw coming, and in a single moment, her life and the lives of those around her changed in ways no one could have imagined. Amara was just 7 years old, but she had already learned that hunger doesn't care how young you are. Her parents worked tirelessly, doing everything they could to keep their family afloat, but sometimes even endless effort isn't enough. The cupboards in their tiny home were almost always bare, and meals, when they came, were small and stretched too thin. Every day, Amara would watch her parents' faces as they tried to hide the worry that crept in like an unwelcome visitor. She saw it in the way her father avoided meeting her gaze at the dinner table, where scraps of bread were broken and shared. She saw it in her mother's trembling hands as she folded laundry in the dim light of their single bulb. For a child, hope can be a fragile thing, but Amara clung to it because she had to. She didn't know what the answer was, but she knew she couldn't let her family fall apart. One day, she overheard whispers from neighbors about a big event happening in the city. A man everyone seemed to know, Donald Trump, was coming to speak. She didn't fully understand who he was or why so many people cared, but she caught on to something in their voices: power, influence, the ability to make things happen. Amara couldn't shake the thought. It lingered in her mind all day and stayed with her through the night. Lying on the thin mattress she shared with her siblings, she stared at the cracked ceiling, her mind racing. Could someone like him help her family? Could she even get close enough to ask? It was a question she didn't know how to answer, but the more she thought about it, the less she could ignore it. The morning of the event arrived, and Amara didn't tell her parents where she was going. She didn't know how to explain it, and she didn't want them to stop her. All she knew was that she had to try. She slipped on her worn shoes, the soles nearly falling apart, and stepped outside. The cold bit at her skin, but she hardly noticed. Determination burned inside her, and nothing else mattered. When she arrived at the venue, the sight before her was overwhelming. The crowd was massive, a sea of people jostling for position, their voices blending into an unending hum of noise. Amara hesitated at first, unsure of where to go or what to do, but then she spotted an opening in the throng. She didn't think twice, her small frame allowed her to slip through unnoticed as she made her way closer to the front. The closer she got, the faster her heart raced. She didn't have a plan. She didn't know what she was going to say if someone stopped her. All she had was the image of her parents' tired faces etched in her mind and the gnawing thought that this might be her only chance to change things. And then, it happened. A slight misstep, a toe catching on the edge of the carpet, and suddenly she was falling. The ground rushed up to meet her, and the thud of her landing seemed louder than it should have been. Heads turned. People nearby stopped talking, their attention pulled to the little girl sprawled awkwardly on the floor. For a moment, she didn't move, the shock of the fall momentarily freezing her in place. A voice, sharp and unforgiving, broke through the murmurs of the crowd. "Hey! What are you doing here?" She looked up to see a tall man in a uniform standing over her, his face a mixture of irritation and suspicion. Her stomach twisted as she tried to find words, but nothing came. Before she could even explain herself, his hand reached out, gripping her arm. His movements were rough, hurried, as if she were an inconvenience to be dealt with quickly. She winced, the pain of his grip bringing tears to her eyes. And then, without warning, the shove came. It wasn't violent, but it was enough to send her stumbling backward, her small frame unable to keep balance. She hit the floor again, this time harder, the sting of the impact spreading across her side. She heard gasps ripple through the crowd, but the faces around her blurred as tears filled her eyes. The humiliation was unbearable, but the pain was even worse. And then, just as quickly as the scene had erupted, it froze. Another voice cut through the air, commanding and undeniable. "Stop." It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that silenced everyone. Amara looked up through her tears and saw him, Donald Trump, standing tall and staring directly at the guard who had pushed her. There was no mistaking the disapproval in his gaze. "Bring her here," he said, his tone firm but calm. The guard hesitated, glancing around as if unsure of what to do. But Trump didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. Slowly, the guard stepped aside, and one of Trump's aides moved forward, helping Amara to her feet. She stumbled slightly, clutching her injured arm, but she stood, her wide eyes fixed on the man who had just intervened. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded slightly, unsure of what to say. "What's your name?" he continued, kneeling so that he was at her level. For the first time since the incident began, she found her voice, though it was barely more than a whisper. "Amara," she said. "Why are you here, Amara?" he asked, his tone gentle but curious. And then, as if the floodgates had opened, the words spilled out. She told him everything, her parents' struggles, their hunger, her desperation to find someone who could help. She spoke quickly, her voice trembling, but she didn't stop until there was nothing left to say. The crowd was silent. All eyes were on her, and yet she felt, for the first time, like she wasn't invisible. Trump listened intently, nodding occasionally, his expression a mixture of understanding and sadness. When she finished, he stood and looked around the room, addressing his team. "Take care of her," he said. "Make sure her family has everything they need." And just like that, everything changed. Amara froze. The guard's grip was firm, and she could feel her pulse quicken as tears threatened to spill. She wanted to explain, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. The moment stretched on, the crowd murmuring in hushed tones. The guard began to pull her away when the voice rang out again, this time sharper. "Stop." It was a single word, but it cut through the tension like a blade. The crowd quieted. Amara looked up and saw him, Donald Trump, standing still, his eyes locked on her. There was no anger in his gaze, no confusion. Just a steady, deliberate focus that made even the guard hesitate. "Bring her here," he said, his voice calm but firm. The guard released his grip, almost reluctantly, stepping back as Amara stood there trembling. Another man, a staff member, maybe moved toward her and gently guided her forward. She stumbled slightly, her knees still weak from the fall, but she kept walking. The noise of the crowd faded into the background, replaced by the sound of her own breathing, loud and shaky. As she reached the edge of the stage, Trump knelt down so they were at eye level. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His tone was different now, gentle, almost fatherly. Amara hesitated, her small hands clutching her arm where the guard had grabbed her. "A little," she whispered, barely loud enough to be heard. "What's your name?" he asked. "Amara," she said, her voice trembling. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just nodded, his expression softening. Then, after a pause, he asked the question that would change everything. "Why are you here, Amara?" Her lip quivered as she tried to speak. The words were stuck in her throat, tangled with fear and emotion. But then she looked up at him, and something about his gaze, steady and patient, gave her the courage to begin. "My family," she started, her voice breaking. "We don't have enough food. My mom and dad, they try, but it's never enough. And I thought maybe you could help us." The words spilled out all at once, and as they did, the weight she had been carrying seemed to lift, if only slightly. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Amara wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, her small frame trembling with the effort of speaking her truth. Trump listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he stood up and turned to his staff. "Take care of her," he said firmly. "Make sure her family gets everything they need." There was a pause, and then the crowd erupted into applause. Amara didn't know what to do. She stood there, overwhelmed, as one of Trump's aides approached and guided her to the side of the stage. But as she looked back, she caught his eye one last time. He nodded at her, a small gesture that somehow said everything. Amara's legs felt shaky as she stepped closer, her tiny feet moving almost instinctively. The world around her felt impossibly big, faces she didn't recognize, voices that felt distant yet overwhelming, and a swirl of movement that didn't seem to slow down. She tucked her chin slightly, as if that would make her invisible, but deep down, she knew she couldn't turn back. She wasn't supposed to be here, but something stronger than fear kept her moving forward. She had come for a reason. The voices around her sounded so different, sharp, confident, full of energy that didn't match the quiet streets she came from. She glanced at the polished shoes of the people standing in clusters, their laughter echoing like they didn't have a care in the world. For a moment, her steps faltered. Would anyone here even understand why she had come? She forced herself to keep going. Then, through the sea of people, she saw him. Donald Trump stood tall, his movements measured, his gestures deliberate as he addressed the crowd. Even at a distance, his presence felt magnetic. The faces in the audience were fixed on him, their attention unwavering. Amara felt her heartbeat quicken. Her eyes darted toward the stage, her breathing uneven. This was the man everyone talked about, the one who could change lives with just a few words. What would you have done if you were in her shoes? Would you have stepped forward, or would the weight of it all have stopped you? Amara didn't know what she was going to say. The words she had practiced in her head on the way here seemed to vanish the closer she got. What if no one listened? What if they told her to leave? But then she thought of her mother's tired face, her father's quiet sighs after another long day, and her siblings' wide, hungry eyes. She had to try. As she approached the stage, her hands felt clammy. The crowd seemed endless, and the noise around her grew louder. She lowered her head, trying to avoid the stares of those she passed. Her small frame helped her slip through unnoticed, but the weight of each step felt heavier. The stage was now just a few feet away. She could feel the enormity of the moment pressing against her chest. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Suddenly, her toe caught on the edge of the carpet, and her balance gave way. She stumbled forward, landing on her hands and knees. A sharp gasp escaped her, but before she could recover, the sound of her fall had already drawn attention. "Hey! What are you doing?" a voice barked. Her head shot up, and she was met with the cold stare of a security guard. His eyes narrowed as he stepped toward her, his presence looming. "You're not supposed to be here," he snapped, reaching for her arm. Amara flinched as his grip tightened. "Wait," she tried to say, but her voice cracked. Her fear was immediate, but it wasn't just the guard that frightened her. It was the realization that everything she had worked up the courage to do might be over before she even had the chance to try. The guard began to pull her back, his movements firm and impatient. Her arm ached under his grip, and she struggled to free herself. Her eyes darted toward the stage, desperate for someone to notice. And then, someone did. "Let her go," a voice commanded. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that silenced the air around them. The guard stopped, his head snapping toward the stage. Amara turned her tear-streaked face toward the source of the voice, her chest tightening as she saw him, Donald Trump, standing still, his gaze locked on her. "Bring her here," he said, his tone calm yet firm. The room seemed to hold its breath. Amara felt the guard's grip loosen. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure if she was imagining what had just happened. But then another man stepped forward, his hand outstretched toward her. She took it hesitantly, her legs shaking as he helped her to her feet. The crowd was silent now. Every eye was on her as she was guided toward the stage. Her small frame felt even smaller under the weight of their stares. Her breathing was uneven, and her hands trembled, but she kept walking. She didn't mean to cause a scene. Amara just wanted to get closer, to stand where she could finally feel seen, but the moment spiraled out of her control. Her small foot caught the edge of the carpet, and before she could steady herself, she tumbled forward. The world around her seemed to stop as her knees hit the ground. For a second, she stayed there, frozen. A sharp sting ran up her legs, but it wasn't the pain that gripped her. It was the weight of countless eyes suddenly fixed on her. Amara slowly raised her head, her cheeks burning as tears began to blur her vision. The conversations around her had gone silent, the noise replaced by the stillness of attention she didn't ask for. The air felt heavy. Amara could hear the faint shuffle of people adjusting themselves, the way a collective unease spread across the crowd. Whispers started at the edges, soft murmurs of confusion that grew as her small frame came into view. She wanted to speak, to explain why she was there, but her voice refused to cooperate. Her chest tightened, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to push herself upright. "What are you doing here?" A voice snapped her out of the haze. It was sharp, stern, and unkind. Amara looked up to see a guard stepping toward her, his imposing figure making her instinctively shrink back. Her lips parted, but the words caught in her throat. I, she stammered, but before she could finish, the guard reached out and grabbed her arm. The grip was firm, too firm. She winced, her small fingers curling around his in an attempt to free herself. Please, she tried again, her voice cracking. You're not supposed to be here, he barked, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Without hesitation, he began to pull her back, dragging her away from the stage. The crowd didn't know how to react. Some people watched in silence, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Others shifted uneasily, their gazes darting between the child and the stage. Amara's tears spilled freely now, the overwhelming fear swallowing her entirely. And then, everything stopped. Let her go. The voice was steady, calm, and deliberate. It carried over the murmurs with a clarity that demanded attention. Amara turned her head, her teary eyes landing on the man who had spoken. Donald Trump stood at the edge of the stage, his face a mixture of surprise and concern. The guard froze, his hand still gripping her arm. He glanced toward the stage, his confusion evident as he processed what he had just heard. Bring her here, Trump said, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. The moment felt impossibly still. Amara's heart raced as the guard released her arm. Another man, a member of Trump's team, stepped forward, his movements gentler as he knelt and offered her his hand. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she could trust anyone, but the look in his eyes reassured her. Slowly, she reached out and allowed him to guide her forward. What do you think was going through her mind? If you were standing in her place, what would you have felt? The room had gone silent as she approached the stage. The distance felt endless, her small feet barely lifting off the ground as she moved closer. Her tears hadn't stopped, but she wiped at them furiously, determined not to show any more weakness. When she finally reached the stage, Trump knelt down so that their eyes met. Are you okay? He asked, his voice softer now, a stark contrast to the commanding tone he had used just moments before. Amara nodded hesitantly, though the tears still clung to her lashes. Her hands gripped the hem of her jacket, twisting the fabric nervously. What's your name? He asked, his gaze steady and patient. Amara, she whispered. What are you doing here, Amara? His question wasn't harsh. It was curious, almost gentle, as if he genuinely wanted to know. Her lips trembled as she tried to answer, the words coming slowly at first. I just wanted to ask for help, she said, her voice barely audible. My family, we don't have enough food. I thought maybe you could help us. The honesty of her words hung in the air, their weight pressing on everyone who heard them. Trump's expression softened, his gaze unwavering as he listened. He didn't interrupt her, didn't rush her, just let her speak. As her story unfolded, the tension in the room shifted. The crowd, once filled with whispers and uncertainty, now watched with quiet reverence. Amara's voice grew steadier as she shared her family's struggles, each word a reflection of the resilience she had carried with her. Hey! What are you doing here? The voice came out sharp, loud enough to cut through the murmurs of the crowd. Amara flinched, her wide eyes darting upward to meet the guard who now towered over her. His face was cold, his brow furrowed as if she were an unwelcome interruption to his day. Her mouth opened to answer, but nothing came out. Before she could gather herself, his hand shot out and pushed her back. The force wasn't meant to harm, perhaps, but it was more than her small frame could handle. She stumbled and fell again, this time landing awkwardly on her side. Her elbow struck the hard floor, sending a sharp pain shooting up her arm. Tears spilled over as she curled her fingers around her arm, cradling it close to her chest. Her breathing hitched as she fought to hold in the sobs building in her throat. Around her, the crowd seemed frozen, the hum of voices gone. Get up, the guard barked, his tone impatient and dismissive. He stepped closer, looming above her like a shadow she couldn't escape. Amara winced, trying to push herself up with her free hand, but the ache in her body and the weight of humiliation held her down. What would you have done if you were in her place? Could you have found the strength to speak? Amara didn't know what to do. All she could think about was the faces staring down at her, their expressions unreadable. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear, but her legs wouldn't move. The lump in her throat grew tighter as she braced for whatever would happen next. And then, something changed. "Stop!" The word echoed across the room, firm and commanding. The guard froze mid-step, his head snapping toward the voice. Amara followed his gaze and saw him, Donald Trump. He stood at the edge of the stage, his hand raised slightly as if to halt the chaos. His expression wasn't angry, but it wasn't passive either. There was a sharpness in his gaze that made everyone around him pause. "Let her go," Trump said, his voice steady and clear. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. The guard stepped back, his posture stiff as he glanced between Amara and the stage. For a moment, no one moved. The room felt impossibly quiet, the tension so thick it seemed to press against her skin. "Bring her here," Trump added, his tone softening slightly but losing none of its authority. Amara's heart raced as one of the aides came forward, offering her a hand. She hesitated, unsure if she could trust him, but something about the way Trump's eyes remained fixed on her gave her courage. Slowly, she reached out and allowed the aide to help her to her feet. Her legs wobbled as she stood, her arms still aching from the fall. The stares of the crowd bore down on her, but she kept her eyes on the stage, focusing on the man who had spoken up for her. With small, hesitant steps, she began to walk toward him. The distance felt endless, each step heavier than the last. Her heart pounded in her chest, louder than the noise around her, but she kept moving. What do you think she was feeling in that moment? Fear? Relief? Would you have had the courage to keep walking? As she reached the edge of the stage, Trump stepped forward, kneeling slightly so their eyes met. His expression had softened now, his gaze filled with something closer to concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice quieter than she expected. Amara nodded, clutching her arm tightly. Her lips quivered as she tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone patient and kind. "Amara," she whispered, barely loud enough for him to hear. "Why are you here, Amara?" His question was simple, but the weight of it made her chest tighten. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room before finally meeting his again. I needed help," she said, her voice cracking. The tears she had tried so hard to hold back started falling again as she continued. "My family doesn't have enough to eat. I thought, maybe you could help us." The room was silent, every word she spoke hanging in the air. Trump didn't look away, his expression unreadable as he listened. When she finished, he stood up straight, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Make sure she's taken care of," he said, his voice carrying the same authority as before. He turned to one of his aides and added, "Her family too. Whatever they need." Amara blinked in disbelief, her tears now a mix of relief and exhaustion. She looked up at Trump, and for the first time since she'd walked into the room, she felt seen. The room held its breath as a commanding voice cut through the silence, "Stop." It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that immediately froze everyone in place. The security guard let go of Amara's arm, stepping back in hesitation, his expression unsure. The crowd shifted their focus, and all eyes turned to the man who had spoken. Amara, still clutching her arm, looked up through tear-filled eyes. Her vision blurred, but she could make out his figure as he began to move toward her. He stepped down from the stage, his movements purposeful yet calm. There was no anger in his expression, no impatience, only something that felt almost curious. He didn't rush, but there was no hesitation in his steps either. "Bring her to me," he said, his voice firm but measured. He gestured toward her, his attention unwavering. One of his aides gently guided her forward, and she stumbled slightly, her legs still weak from fear and exhaustion. She kept her head down, her hands still gripping her arm tightly. But as she got closer, she felt his gaze on her, not harsh, not judging, but steady and somehow reassuring. She stopped a few steps away from him, unsure of what to do next. Her chest heaved as she tried to calm her breathing, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. He knelt slightly, just enough to meet her at eye level. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice softer now. Amara nodded slowly, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. She couldn't find her voice, so she simply showed him her arm, the reddened mark where the guard's hand had gripped her too hard. For a moment, he didn't say anything. His eyes flicked to the mark on her arm, then back to her face. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone patient. "Amara," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Amara," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "Why are you here?" Her lips trembled as she tried to answer. The weight of the crowd's attention felt unbearable, but his steady gaze gave her just enough courage to speak. I just wanted to ask for help," she said, her voice breaking slightly. She hesitated, then added, "My family, we don't have enough food." The words hung in the air, heavy and unmissable. She looked down, her fingers gripping her jacket tighter. "I thought, maybe you could help us," she finished, her voice no louder than a whisper. For a moment, the room was silent. The crowd, the murmurs, the shuffling, all of it seemed to fade. Trump's expression didn't change, but there was a shift in the way he carried himself. He stood up straight, looking at one of his aides before speaking again. "Take care of her," he said simply. "Make sure her family gets what they need." The aide nodded and moved quickly to the side of the stage, speaking into a phone. Trump turned back to Amara, his gaze softening slightly. "You're very brave," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Amara blinked up at him, her tears still clinging to her lashes. She didn't know what to say. She didn't even know if she could speak. But in that moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "Why are you here, Amara?" Trump's voice was calm, steady, and filled with curiosity as he knelt to her level. He wasn't in a hurry. He was giving her space, letting her find the words she needed. Amara hesitated, her small fingers fidgeting with the edge of her jacket. She looked down, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, trembling with emotion. "I just wanted to ask for help," she said, her words catching in her throat. She paused, trying to gather her strength before continuing. "My family, we don't have enough food." The room felt impossibly still, the quiet amplifying her voice as it carried through the space. Her tears started again, but she didn't try to stop them this time. Her shoulders trembled slightly as she added, "I thought maybe someone like you could help us." Her words landed heavily, resonating in the silent crowd. The simplicity of her plea, the rawness of her honesty, made everyone feel the weight of her struggle. Amara wasn't asking for much, just the chance to make things a little easier for her family. Trump's expression didn't change immediately. For a moment, he simply looked at her, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, it softened. His eyes held something close to understanding, a quiet empathy that didn't need to be spoken aloud. "You're very brave," he said, his voice quieter now, almost as if he didn't want to break the moment. Amara blinked up at him, her tears clinging to her lashes. She hadn't expected to hear those words. For so long, she had felt small, invisible, like her voice didn't matter. But now, standing in front of someone who could change everything, she felt something different, a flicker of hope, fragile but present. Trump stood and turned slightly, gesturing to his team without hesitation. "Make sure her family gets what they need," he said firmly. His tone left no room for questions, no space for doubt. "Food, medical care, whatever it takes." The staff moved quickly, whispering instructions to one another as they got to work. Amara stood there, still unsure if she should believe what was happening. Could it really be this simple? Could asking for help really lead to something changing? Trump looked back at her, his gaze steady. "You did the right thing by speaking up," he said, his tone encouraging. "Not everyone has the courage to do that." She didn't know how to respond. All she could do was nod, her small hands clutching the fabric of her jacket tightly. The words she had been too scared to say had been heard, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she mattered. What would you have done in her place? Would you have found the courage to speak up, even when the odds seemed impossible? Trump straightened, his expression resolute as he turned to his team without hesitation. "Get her family the help they need," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "Food, medical care, whatever it takes. Don't waste a moment." His tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. The aides around him moved quickly, speaking into phones and gesturing to one another as they began organizing immediate assistance. Amara stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Could it really be this simple? The overwhelming fear she had carried into the room began to lift, replaced by a cautious hope she hadn't dared to feel before. The crowd, which had watched in stunned silence, began to shift. Someone near the back clapped, a single sound that quickly spread, joined by more and more hands. The tension that had weighed so heavily moments earlier melted away as the applause grew louder. Faces that had been uncertain now softened, their expressions reflecting something closer to admiration and understanding. Amara felt her tears slowing. The ache in her chest eased as the sound of the clapping surrounded her, a warmth she had never expected to feel. She glanced up at Trump again, and for the first time, her lips curled into a small, hesitant smile. What do you think the crowd felt in that moment? Relief? Respect? Could they see the bigger picture unfolding right in front of them? Trump's focus never wavered. He reached out, gently placing a hand on Amara's shoulder. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was enough to anchor her in the moment. "You're stronger than most people I know," he said quietly, his words meant just for her. In that instant, it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about speeches or agendas. It wasn't even about the cameras, which now captured the scene in full view. It was about something far simpler, a moment of humanity, a reminder that even the smallest voice can make a difference if someone is willing to listen. Amara glanced around, the faces of strangers looking back at her with a warmth she didn't recognize but welcomed. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt seen not as someone small or invisible, but as someone who mattered. The aides returned, confirming that her family would receive the help they needed. "We'll make sure they're cared for," one of them said to Trump, who gave a brief nod before turning his attention back to Amara. "You did the right thing," he said, his tone softer now. "Don't ever forget that." Amara didn't have the words to respond, but her eyes spoke volumes. She nodded, her grip tightening on her jacket as she stood a little taller. For the first time, she felt something shift inside her. The weight of worry was still there, but it no longer felt impossible to carry. Do you think one moment can truly change a life? What would you have done if you were in her shoes? As Amara walked away from the stage, her heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. Her steps were small, but they carried a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. For her, it wasn't just about the help she had received, it was about being seen, about being heard, about knowing that her voice mattered. Amara's story isn't just about a little girl standing in front of a room full of strangers. It's about courage, about taking a step forward even when fear tells you to stay still. It's about believing that your voice, no matter how small it feels, can create change. Sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one act of bravery, to make a difference. Amara's story is a reminder to all of us that no matter how overwhelming life may seem, no matter how small or powerless we might feel, there's strength in speaking up. There's power in asking for help. And there's beauty in the compassion of those who choose to listen. So, let me ask you, what would you do if you were in Amara's shoes? Would you have found the courage to step forward? Or would fear have held you back? If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear it today. A story like Amara's isn't just about her, it's about all of us. It's about remembering that kindness matters, that every voice counts, and that sometimes, hope begins with the smallest of steps. And before you go, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to bring more stories like this to life, stories that remind us of the good in the world and the strength we all carry within us. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being part of this journey. Together, let's keep sharing stories that inspire, connect, and remind us what truly matters.